Welcome to This Constitution. I'm Savannah Eccles Johnston.
And I'm Matthew Brogdon.
And today we're going to recap the 2024 presidential election. When we first thought about this episode, we were expecting it to be a much tighter race with lots of complications and interesting constitutional questions to be answered. It was very chill.
Yeah.
This was not what we were expecting from the election.
Yeah, it's Thursday morning at 9 a.m. We're less than 48 hours from Election Day, and we've known for 24 hours what the outcome is. I'm not sure anybody expected that degree of decisiveness.
Right, and we have an incoming president who didn't just win the Electoral College, is probably going to sweep 7 of 7 swing states, and will win the direct popular vote and a majority of the vote.
That's right. All three of which are different things. We always think of these as sort of being the same thing, but about a third of the time, nobody wins the popular vote these days, at least for the last 100 and almost 200 years.
You mean the majority?
The majority, that's right. Nobody wins a majority of the popular vote. So most of the time, we're relying on a plurality.
Right.
It's not an exceptional thing, but it at least is an important thing when somebody actually wins the popular vote, more than 50%.
So he's 3 for 3 in 2024. Let's put this in context. Bush did not get 3 for 3 in 2000. He did in 2004. Mm-hmm. Obama did in 2008. Mm-hmm. And also in 2012. Mm-hmm. Trump did not in 2016. And did Biden get the majority?
Biden did get
in 2020?
A majority.
Okay.
In 2020.
There you go.
It's Republican presidents have struggled a little bit. Well, it's not entirely fair. Like you said, Bush got one. It's the first time, and the headline from the New York Times was first time in 20 years that a Republican got a majority of the popular vote. We actually struggled in the 90s too, because remember we had a spoiler for Clinton's elections. We had Ross Perot, which meant nobody got anywhere close to a majority in 92 and 96.
Right.
Reagan won majorities. This is the thing about American politics. We have close elections. When American politics is running in the way it normally runs, old hat for us is very closely contested elections.
But also we have eras where one political party dominates presidential election after presidential election, right? Republicans for 30 plus years, the beginning of the 19th century, and then the FDR coalition for 32 years.
Yeah.
So it's we're actually in kind of an odd era where we're switching between equal party strength, and now we seem to be entering an era, hopefully not permanently, of one-term presidents, back and forth. And we really haven't done that since the 1840s, 1850s.
Yeah, we've gotten used to divided government being the norm at this point, which has been the norm for quite some time. It used to be, you pointed out, the early 20th century. I mean, since the Civil War, we kind of went through periods of one-party control for 10, 15 years, followed by a brief period, maybe a decade of, parties contesting the election and having divided government, having different parties winning the White House and Congress. And then that usually would settle back into one-party control again for a stretch of time. And then another period of realignment. And for the last party to really do that was Democrats.
Right.
Up until Reagan to some extent, although they had to suffer through Republican presidents. So really, since the New Deal coalition fell apart,
right,
in the middle of the 20th century, we haven't really had sustained one-party control of the government.
Though Democrats maintained that FDR coalition all the way up until the 90s in Congress.
In Congress.
In the presidency, no. But so Reagan builds this coalition. The Reagan coalition is not the coalition that elected Donald Trump, though. We seem to have a new coalition, and a strange, unstable era in American politics of really, really tightly contested elections. And I don't see this as the beginning of a new era of one-party control.
No.
Right. That's not what we're entering
into.
No,
we're reconfiguring the electorate into more contested elections. It's just the group of people on each side are reconfiguring a little bit. The biggest turnover in that regard that this election really highlighted was Republicans are now, and this is a broad generalization, Republicans are now the party of the working class.
Right.
Democrats are the party of the economic and social elite. And that is a switch. Now, we've been going through that for a while. I actually think George W. Bush represented some shift in that direction, right? Some Republicans being more
working class types.
Working class type, though, George Bush had owned the Texas Rangers. He wasn't exactly a working class type, but certainly his personality was such that it was appealing to that. So we've undergone that shift in a significant regard. That's affected also the Democrats' diminished hold on certain minority and immigrant populations.
Right. This brings us to the Latino vote. Donald Trump has done better among Latino voters than any Republican since George Bush, speaking of that connection, and seems to actually be building on that and taken more of Black men away and done very well among, it was funny, when you break down the demographic groups, they had, white, Black, Latino, and then just other. He's doing very well among the other, whatever that is.
Asian Americans being the largest part of that group.
Right.
Asian Americans are the fastest growing contingent of Americans outside of our sort of standard categories, ethnic categories. And they have traditionally been not quite the Democratic stronghold that Black Americans were.
Right.
But we're traditionally a Democratic constituency, and that has shifted significantly as well. Also, first and second generation immigrants voting for Trump, at least as far as our exit polls can tell. I mean, we don't have perfect data about this.
Well, and this is something interesting. If a large chunk of immigrants are coming from very conservative countries, that's not a surprise that they would vote for the more socially conservative president. These are not a natural demographic for Democrats then. Though Democrats seem to have convinced themselves that they would be a natural demographic. And you can see that in places like Dearborn, where it's not just Gaza. It's also social policies.
Well, we've become used to, since the Civil War, the American party system has been connected to a politics of race in a significant way, right? The party of Lincoln enjoyed the Black vote in America until the New Deal coalition pulled them away and made them part of the Democratic base. And of course, the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s consolidated that. The fact that Lyndon Johnson and Democrats in Congress managed to oust the segregationist wing of the party and enact civil rights. We've become very used to that. And that seems to me to be crumbling a little bit. Race is losing salience
but what is
for American
gaining
party politics.
Is sex. That seems to be more important. So if you look at Trump's gains among certain racial groups, it's among men primarily in those racial groups. So that is becoming a shockingly salient factor in American politics. And that's global, by the way.
The biggest divide in terms of sex was between Black women and Black men.
Oh, was it?
There was a large divide there. Other men and women, if we look internally to other constituencies, the divide wasn't quite as large as it was in the Black
still
community.
Around 10 points.
It was, although that goes away if you add in children. Men and women who have children did not vote appreciably different in the election.
Which maybe explains why Gen Z, the generational divide, is actually the largest, which is interesting. But again, this is a global phenomenon. And also, I don't think looks good for our birth rate going forward. If there is a political divide between men and women and people are not willing to date those on the other side of the aisle.
It's still not extreme. Actually, it's not as extreme overall. I think the split was about 10 points, but that's not radically outside the range of sex differences in electoral outcomes historically.
But it's more important than race was this election. It tells us more about how Trump was gaining than among race. So
the movement was more substantial.
Was more. No, we're not at South Korea's levels yet, but that's a good thing for sex divide. All right. So let's look at what that means. So Trump, probably 7 out of 7 swing states. He'll get well over 300 points in the Electoral College. 312
is the most likely outcome right now.
Right. Okay. And
that's about 58% of the Electoral College. So the Electoral College is doing its thing that it usually does, which is it takes a 51% popular vote and inflates it up to almost 60% in the Electoral College. So it's doing its thing of magnifying a small difference in the popular vote into a large lead in the Electoral College.
Which is useful, actually, for making a more legitimate presidency. Okay, then we look at the Senate, and it looks like Republicans have taken the Senate. They're at 52 right now, may pick up 1, maybe 2 more seats. The House, we don't know yet. It's tightly contested.
The most important thing about that Senate divide, we still have the filibuster, but We've gotten rid of the filibuster for judicial appointments at this point.
Mm-hmm.
That's a that's a
For
dead letter.
all appointments at this point.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So that means with 52 votes in the Senate, any judicial vacancies should be easy for Trump to fill, and he'll be able to get a cabinet that at least pleases Republicans in the Senate, which might not be exactly the cabinet Trump would pick if he had his own way,
Right.
but will still be much different than if he had a 50-50 split like Biden had in the Senate.
Right. Though what will help him is that you have a 1, maybe 2 vote cushion when it comes to Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who may not go for every single Trump appointment. He'll have a cushion there.
Yeah, there's no Joe Manchin to spoil everything for the Republican Party this time around.
Right. So the moderates are all gone except for Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. They've basically all died this election.
Well,
or retired.
They are. There are some new senators coming in. I mean,
good point. I can't judge them yet. So
I'm curious to see what happens. Someone will spoil the party for Republicans. That is certain.
Maybe
someone in
Joe
the Senate
Manchin
is going to make a mess.
There's a new Kirsten Sinema just waiting to take the mantle. Okay, so this is Trump's big job between now and January 20th is stocking up his cabinet, preparing a transition team, and then preparing his cabinet. In the meantime, the big job on the Democrat side, Biden and Kamala Harris, is a peaceful transfer of power. Kamala Harris gave her concession speech yesterday, which I thought was actually quite good. I thought it was excellent. She spoke, here's a great quote. She said, "In our nation, we owe loyalty not to a president or a party, but to the Constitution of the United States and loyalty to our conscience and to our God." When I heard her say that, I was like, is this George Bush?
Yeah. Or Bill Clinton.
It's an old kind of sentiment, but one that's deeply appreciated, this idea of loyalty to the Constitution and a commitment to the peaceful transfer of power. Her campaign chairman came out early on Wednesday morning and said, we are committed to transferring peacefully. Biden has already called Trump and welcomed him to the White House to begin that transition.
Can I point out one important thing about this? And that is, I think this has broad application to Democratic politics generally. The thing that commits people to a stable set of rules and to following the rules even when they lose is the prospect for those out of power that they might be in power at some point. And for those in power, that they will be out of power at some point. So the power exchanging hands and any given person knowing that whoever's in the driver's seat today might not be tomorrow is a very important fact that reinforces commitment to constitutional principles and to playing by the rules.
Well, and Kamala nodded to that in her speech when she said, I concede this race, but I don't concede the fight.
Yeah.
So she'll be back, or Democrats will be back. But what's interesting about that is that seems to hold true for the Democrats in this election, but it was not self-evident that there would have been a concession on the other side, especially had it been a very tight race.
That's true. Though it does look like democracy's not at an end.
Thank you. I had a lot of students who were quite panicked yesterday that was the last election they would ever vote in, which I think is deeply silly. You've got a midterm coming up in 2 years. No worries. Democracy will march on. Okay, so let's go over what happens between now and inaugurating the president. What is the role of the electors in the Electoral College, and then what is the role of Kamala Harris? Because she has a role still to play. Conceding was not her only role. Unfortunately for her, she's still going to be in the public eye. And of course, Biden will continue to be president. So first, on December 17th, the electors in all the respective states will meet together to officially cast their state's votes, put it in an envelope, and send it to Congress. And you said something very funny earlier. You said it's quite useful that they are in different states and not all together. Why?
You can't kill them all at once. I mean, this was quite deliberate when the framers put together the Electoral College. There are some weird provisions in there that we don't pay a lot of attention to. And one of them is that the electors will meet in their respective states on the same day. So Congress can determine the day that the Electoral College meets. But they have to meet in separate states and they have to do it the same day. That means nobody can cast their vote twice. Right? So there's no crossing state. You can't get from one state to the other in the same day, at least not in the 18th century. no one could, the assumption was no one could pull off some kind of fraud
Right.
all at the same time in multiple states on the same day.
So,
technology has changed that a little bit, but still, these people have to meet in person, face to face, and cast their votes in these small groups in each state. So that does make it very difficult. I mean, a foreign power that wanted to disrupt the casting of electoral votes would actually face a serious logistical problem.
So this decentralization is actually quite useful for protecting the election.
For the Electoral College,
Right.
too. I mean, the fact that we have 51 separate elections for president, not just
Right.
one big national election, actually means that to affect the electoral outcome, usually you'd have to do it in numerous states. In this case, this election, 7 different states, all at the same time.
Right.
That actually makes election fraud very difficult to pull off.
Right. And
At least in a way that's of a wide enough scope that actually affects the outcome of the election.
right. Well, which brings us to faithless electors. It doesn't matter.
Or as I like to call them, just electors.
I'll call them faithless electors.
Okay. All right.
So it doesn't really matter if there are 1 or 2 this election because he's won by such a large margin. I don't think anyone's expecting any faithless electors to begin with. And there has been a real movement in states. 32 states plus the District of Columbia now have regulations requiring electors to cast their vote according to the direct statewide vote. And over half of those include financial penalties and a process by which you would remove that elector, nullify their vote, and select a new elector.
And actually, there are alternates. Most states have
Right, so that would
alternate
step in.
electors in case there's an untimely death,
Right.
something of that kind. I'm not sure if a state, I know that electors have been disqualified for being elected to Congress before or elected to a federal office because the Constitution says you can't do both. I'm not sure if we've actually had the experiment of a state removing
We
an
have
elector
Washington, I think.
on account of not casting their vote in accordance with the state's directions.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court decision on this was in reaction to, I think it was Colorado and Washington.
Yeah, it was Chiafalo.
One penalized and one removed and nullified that vote.
Oh, okay.
And from what I understand.
I knew about the penalty. I didn't realize they had removed and nullified it. But
That's at least what
I think that's
understand.
probably unconstitutional, but we'll save that for another episode.
Yeah, I disagree. All right, so we'll leave that aside. So then once they have cast their votes and they've sent their nice little envelopes to both the president of the Senate and to the archivist of the National Archive, which apparently you've told me is one of the longest standing positions in
been around
American
a long time.
politics. Okay, great. Glad that person exists. Then
somebody's got to keep in every office, somebody's got to make sure that the important piece of paper goes in the file at some point and knows where to find it.
Good point.
And this has been the archivist for 230 years now.
Right. The quiet hero of American politics.
That's right.
Right. So how are they selected, by the way? They're nonpartisan. They're just
the archivist of the United States is, I'm pretty sure, a political appointment.
Oh, really?
They're the head of the
Okay.
National
There we go.
Archives. It's the National Archives and Records Administration.
Okay.
It is
and
an
that's a partisan...
executive. It's an executive agency.
Wow. All right. Okay.
Well, I wouldn't call it partisan. I think
selected by a partisan president. There you go.
I don't think it's like a cabinet position
Right.
that we routinely turn people out when the presidency changes. But
Right.
I'm pretty sure it requires Senate approval, and I don't know.
I
Never
have
really
no
looked into it,
idea.
to be honest.
Right. Okay. So then January 6th, it is the job of the vice president, who has just lost this election, Kamala Harris, to stand before Congress and open the envelopes and read out the votes while they're tallied and then declare the winner. Now, she will not be the first vice president to preside over her own defeat, though each time I actually find it deeply impressive. So Nixon does this in 1961. And Al Gore does this in 2001.
Yeah.
And it's a great moment for American democracy when the loser has to stand up and declare their opponent the winner officially.
Frequent.
It's a good thing. So she will have to do that January 6th. There is some concern that I've heard that, she will refuse to certify. She has no power to refuse to certify the election just constitutionally. And this was clarified in a 2022 law as well.
Yeah, this is pretty clear from the constitutional text. I know we had a little argument over this in 2020, but the text actually doesn't say that the vice president counts the votes.
Right.
It says, in the presence of the House and Senate, the vice president shall open the votes, which shall then be counted.
Right.
It uses the passive voice.
Right.
So it doesn't actually assign the counting to anyone in particular. It just says they shall then be counted.
Right.
But it puts in the active voice that the vice president or the president of the Senate shall open the votes in the presence of. So they got to remain sealed. They open them. Traditionally, they read them out. They open it and they say X number of votes from this state for Kamala Harris, X number of votes for Donald Trump. And then someone else actually keeps the tally. Now, it is undoubted that if some dispute arises about how many votes were cast for someone, it's unavoidable that Congress is there in joint session. Clearly, Congress is going to have to settle the controversy. Which actually we had this weird argument about that too. A few people were like, no, Congress can't do anything about this or refuse to certify votes. And it was like, well, who is this mysterious person who's going to show up and like say, you 535 elected people stand to the side. I'm going to settle this controversy. So it is unavoidable in a way that if there was a controversy, and there was in 1876, Congress would have to come up with a way to fix it. And they've done that with the Electoral Count Act.
But in 2024, there is no anticipated controversy. There's just a clear winner in the Electoral College.
This is a minuscule but non-zero number.
So Kamala Harris will stand up in a purely ceremonial role and declare her own defeat.
That's right.
And that's her entire role. So that's what she has to look forward to in the next few months, other than, I'm sure, getting some more sleep.
This wonderful emblem of the peaceful transfer of power.
I deeply appreciate this process, actually. I really like that a loser might have to stand up and in a constitutional role certify their opponents. I think it's great. All right, so there we go. That's what Harris will be doing. This is what Trump will be doing. And this takes us to what to expect. Trump won't be inaugurated until January 20th, right? So we've got a little bit of a gap there. And what do we expect from Trump in his first 2 years? That kind of honeymoon period when presidents typically, or not always, but typically enjoy a more unified Congress and can get one, maybe two big pieces of legislation passed. For example, his big piece of legislation in 2017 was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This time, maybe even harder, because we're not sure if he's going to have a unified Congress. And even if he does, it'll be at such razor-thin majorities in the House.
I should point out one thing. Historically, if he gets unified government in the modern era of closely contested elections and minuscule margins, the party that gets unified control almost always loses at the midterm.
Oh, but this is just the midterm effect, where the president's party always loses seats in the midterm, except for one time with Bill Clinton. So,
but in the era, so this is a weird situation. You might actually be better off winding up with a narrow loss in one house of Congress during the presidential election. You can blame the other party for we haven't been able to move forward, we haven't gotten it done. Then you actually have a chance to pick up seats at the midterm. That can happen. In the context of divided government, that almost never happens. The president gets punished.
You even see this 2008 and Obama. He didn't win narrow majorities in the House or the Senate. He had quite significant majorities and was just killed in the 2010 midterms in the House.
And partly over the bailout in Obamacare.
But also this is normal. Presidents will lose seats. The only question is how many they will lose. But even Obama, with these big majorities, really just gets one big piece of legislation, Obamacare.
But we should point out, too, that actually divided government performs just as well, if not better, at actually generating meaningful legislation.
Is that true in the 21st century, though? I don't believe that.
Francis Lee and James Curry, in their most recent book, back in 2020 of all times, made this case and made it pretty compellingly. We don't notice the most, and also even in unified government, the most meaningful, durable pieces of legislation pass with substantial bipartisan majorities, which means they would have passed even in the context of divided government. Maybe the poster child is like Obamacare. We think, well, Democrats passed Obamacare, but Obamacare had very little appreciable long-term effect. Most of its core policies wound up being repealed or abrogated. The Supreme Court took a swipe at it with the Medicaid requirement, and then Republicans made the individual responsibility payment a non-issue until it's been really cleaved down to what were its most bipartisan, most popular elements.
What about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act? That's the kind of the signature legislative achievement for the first 2 years of the Trump administration last time. That was passed along very partisan lines, but its effects haven't been nullified.
It was a temporary tax cut.
Okay, so it's re-upped potentially
Maybe
in this next Congress. We'll see.
If he wins again. You have to win another election to get that kind of legislation
right, you gotta get
to last. But I think we don't notice significant legislation that passes in the context of divided government because it tends to be stuff with large bipartisan majorities, and therefore it's not controversial and it doesn't wind up on the front page and nobody's mad about it on Twitter.
Well, actually, there is something to say for that. Even in the Biden years, the infrastructure package was done by a bipartisan group of senators. What they call themselves? Was this a gang of 6, a gang of 8, gang of 12? I don't know. It's always some gang. It was a gang.
It was West Side Story.
There we go.
And they were passing legislation.
Yeah, and it's very bipartisan and fair point, and not deeply controversial either. Well, this is a good point. So
we'll let the political scientists keep arguing about it.
Right. So what we basically have is what was supposed to be a potentially very controversial, very contentious presidential election, which it was up until November 5th, turning into a very peaceful and decisive election result. American politics continues to surprise us.
That's right. And in 4 years, Donald Trump will not be eligible to run for president.
Right.
And we'll get somebody new at the head of the Republican Party, which will be probably the most important change in American politics.
Right. And to clarify, there will be another election in 2 years. So elections aren't over. The cycles aren't over.
That's right.
We march on.
We march on.